unlike Margaret, I am going to use the word reform because I'm chair of the Political and Constitutional Reform Select Committee. There are occasions when I have to remind the odd member on my committee that we do have the word reform in the title, but only very, very occasionally. But what I'd like to try and do is maybe zoom back a little bit and flesh out some broader truths as I see them. And this isn't a technical or a dry process. This is about hard politics. It's about power politics. And it's about the exercise of power in our country. And a lot of that, for me, revolves around asking ourselves the question, are we really living in a democracy? I think we have a very, very strong democratic culture. And I think that's worth all the written constitutions laid end to end in the world. However, I'm greedy. I'd also like a few other things written down as well. But a democratic culture also needs democratic institutions. And I think if we give ourselves a quick health check before we get too much into the detail of the process, we'll look around and we will see local government, which isn't independent, it is the creature of statute, unlike virtually every other Western democracy. We will see half the lawmaking process in the United Kingdom made by people who are not elected in our second chamber. We will see that below executive power, at certainly English regional level, there is no democratic accountability. We will see that our own Parliament is the creature of the executive, and twice nightly I prove that, as does Eleanor and other parliamentary colleagues going through the lobbies. The concept of parliamentary sovereignty was at best a myth and is now actually becoming quite dangerous unless we examine where we can go from there. And finally, our own executive, all those in and around number 10 and the senior places in Whitehall have at best an indirect familiarity with the ballot box, being the party leader who becomes the Prime Minister, but at worst, including those who exercise power in the media, no impact whatsoever with the popular democratic culture that's exercised through a ballot box. So there's a little bit of weighting against public participation, against public legitimacy, which I think underlines a lot of the arguments that we may get into today. And yes, there are very strong democratic consequences for that, but I'm afraid to say, particularly over the last few years, a dawning about the globalization of world economies indicates to me that we are much weaker for not having effective democratic process, effective legislative capability, effective participation throughout the UK. So the elephant in the room, in a sense, is executive sovereignty. And I think whatever we want to do on process, you must be aware, if you start to tread too close to the elephant of executive power, it may stamp on you. And I think we've seen that in a number of examples where, for example, progress being made on the Right Committee, which I was a member, being delayed, being deferred, being blocked. And I think that's something we need to bear in mind when we talk about process. This is, in essence, many of these arguments devolve back to the concept of, are we going to be supportive of continued executive sovereignty in this country, or is this part of the process of building a pluralistic alternative? Many different institutions, each with their own legitimacy, each with their own independence, choosing to work together for the broader partnership. Executive power, by and large, has been against constitutional change. Things are pretty good for them. They're quite happy with the way things are. Why on earth would they want to change? And if they want to change, they won't change because we've invented a process. They will change because they want to change. And if they want to change, why on earth would they invent a process to do that? When with a tremendous concentration of central power, they can actually do that as and when they like. And classically, pushing through the House of Commons in world record time changes to parliamentary boundaries, a decision to go for a referendum, forward a 5-year parliament, which has been around a long time. Margaret, it was something that parties have been committed to for a long time, and finally has happened. So process seems to infer to me that the executive wants something to happen. But also, process can be used very often to delay things happening. Nothing better than sticking stuff into a committee, normally a joint committee, normally is great and good. Let's count the number of efforts there have been to look at reform of the second chamber. I think Margaret certainly served her time on at least a couple of those. I have too, and there's a long history of stuff being basically process being used to keep things into the long grass. The alternative to process, actually, in our political system, is pressure and circumstance. I guess pressure, I can give an example of pressure at the moment, which I think I'm quite happy is reappearing, which is about local government. For many, many years, local government have accepted their lot to take crumbs from the table as and when statute law is permitted, or as and when government have often wanted someone else to blame for something that's going wrong. Now, within the Local Government Association and elsewhere, there is a pressure building. Government will have to respond to that. There will be a campaign about taking localism a step further. So government will need to decide. When it decides, and I think that's a fundamental constitutional issue, I suspect it won't make a decision based upon a process around constitutional change. I think it will move, if it wants to, fairly quickly to put forward statute law to change the relationship between central and local government. I guess another minor bit of pressure that the committee on which Helena and I serve takes some responsibility, which is the publication of the Cabinet Manual. In our own way, mounting a, I think, quite effective campaign inside Whitehall to actually ensure this appeared in the public domain. And again, that didn't come out of thin air, that came out of the desire of the committee and many other colleagues outside of the committee to press further to release that into the public domain. Circumstances is the second sort of lever, and I guess you could look at what's happening in Scotland as a lever for constitutional change. It's quite possible to see the Scottish example. I think it's incredible we're not having a discussion about why can't the Scots do what the hell they like in terms of running their own lives. I actually want them in the Union, but I don't want them in chains. I want them to go as far as they humanly can in their own system based upon subsidiarity to look after their own affairs. But I don't just want that for Scotland. I want that for my city council. I want that for my region. I want that for my parliament. So I think, again, there's questions will be asked going beyond the immediate, oh my God, they're going to see from the Union how terrible that will be. Do we need an English parliament? I think hopefully there will be a set of circumstances that allow us to think afresh about some sort of federal settlement, and the great chance that was missed in 1997 to do all this as part of a vision for a federal future with a smaller, more nimble parliament and government at the centre, rather than, as we ended up doing, almost homage to John Smith on Scotland and Wales, and very slow, reluctant process, which of course founded on the English regions. Perhaps bringing forward a vision will be the way forward on this, but again, that will need to be done by executive power rather than what we try to conjure up in terms of process inside the House. And again, another example of circumstances, if you like, was because of the scandal around MPs' expenses. There was pressure on government, and circumstances allowed then Prime Minister to create the Right Committee, and the Right Committee made a number of steps forward. I certainly would not be the chair of the Select Committee on Democratic on Public Constitutional Reform, were the whips to have decided who would be appointed. Actually, my parliamentary colleagues decided who should be appointed. and the members of my committee for the first time in the House of Commons being elected by their own parties. So circumstances can allow that to happen, but equally we've seen the advent of the Backbench Business Committee, but the executive are starting to twitch. Slight embarrassments occur, votes occur, little groups of people get together and have views. The executive response is to say, well, I don't know if we should then take the next step recommended by Wright, which was to go for a House Business Committee, where the House of Commons decides its own agenda, rather than being written by Roy Stone in number 10 and number 11 down. So circumstances do play their part. But what process does, and why I'm in favour of what Margaret's done, is process gives legitimacy. And I think, for example, the changes on boundaries, particularly if you throw in the changes that are going to happen on electoral registration, which will reduce the numbers of registered people per constituency again after the next election, which will result in another redrawing of boundaries, particularly in poorer areas where people don't register. Had we been able to have that debate seriously, we could have brought these points up at the right time in a pre-legislative or indeed post-legislative process. So, of course, process is very important. And as a contribution to that, our committee is doing a couple of things. Firstly, with the prompting of some very famous knights of the Round Table, around this square table, Thomas, Christopher and many others, we are going to have a look at the quality of legislation and how we actually get a better quality legislation so we don't keep coming back again next year to correct legislation. And secondly, underpinning a lot of the work we're doing is our proposal to look at a written constitution or not, give the arguments for or against a proper codification and a proper settlement, and produce a draft, should anybody wish to pick that up in the years and decades to come. That is, I believe, sort of broader vision about what's necessary. It does not preclude us doing the short-term on process. It doesn't preclude us doing things properly and better within the House of Commons and within the second chamber. But unless we have an understanding of that bigger picture, unless we refute the mythology that there is parliamentary sovereignty, and unless we work honestly on an open basis of what actually is and what we need to do in terms of that very large open